In the previous lesson, we created a class that represents an individual glossary term. It is aptly named glossary term, and it is very, very simple in that it just has two properties, term and definition, and those essentially describe an individual glossary term object. Now, there's nothing wrong with simple classes because, well, they're simple. They're easy to understand, and as long as they are named well, then you know what they are used for. In this lesson, we're going to create another simple class, but we're going to incorporate methods. Now, a method is really nothing more than a function that works with a particular object. Like, for example, we are going to create a class that encapsulates all of the functionality of our file functions. So we're going to take all of these functions, we're going to cut them out and put them inside of a class. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. Inside of our data folder, let's create a new file. We'll call it FileDataProvider.class.php. And let's go ahead and define that class, FileDataProvider. And then we're just going to paste in all of those functions. Now, we still have a lot of work to do here, but let's go back to our file functions. So this is essentially what we will be able to do. We can create this file data provider. We can pass in the path to the file that we want to work with. And then we can use this object to get the terms, if that's what we want to do. We can use it to search the terms. You know, all of the functionality that we had, we essentially will still have, but it's now encapsulated inside of this class. And it might not be clear as to why we would want to do this now, but I guarantee you this is something that we definitely want to do. So we want to make all of this work, and there's quite a few changes that we need to make. So let's go to our file data provider. Let's define our constructor. So let's go ahead and have that. Now, we need to know the file that we are going to be working with. Now, yes, we have that inside of our config, and we could use our config to do that. However, whenever we create an object, we want it to be its own autonomous thing. We don't want it to be dependent upon anything that is outside of that object. So, in order to know what file that we want to work with, we need to pass that to the constructor so that we can store that in a property. And I didn't mention this in the previous lesson, but a property is a class variable. It is accessible throughout the entire class. So by doing this, we're going to be able to access this file path in every one of these methods. Like, for example, this getData function. Let's go and let's find getData. It's at the very bottom. So here we are using the config, or at least we were using the config to get the data file setting. Well, in this case, we don't want to do that because that is outside of this class. We only want to work with the data that is inside of this class. So we are going to use our file path property there. And notice once again, I'm using this variable in order to access that information because that is part of this class or this object that we are working with. The same thing for the setData function. We want to refer to the file path as opposed to the configuration options. And in fact, we can even get rid of this fname variable because, well, we don't really need that anymore. All of that is part of our class data. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of that. That cleans up our code, except in maybe getData. It might be cleaner to have the fname variable, but we'll just run with this and go from there. Now, if we tried to use this file data provider class right now, everything would fail because we no longer have a function called getTerms or getTerm or searchTerm. Instead, we have methods, and we access these methods the same way that we would access our properties. So we need to use this variable in order to access these methods. So inside of getTerms, where we call getData, we need to put this and then the arrow in front of it. We need to do that in front of all of these calls to these methods. And remember, a method is nothing more than a function, except that it is encapsulated inside of a class. So really the only thing that we are doing here is just changing the location of those functions. And yes, it does require us a little bit of extra work in order to get this all set up, but I guarantee you it is worth the time. The only thing is that we need to make sure we reference all of our methods correctly. And if we didn't, we'll find out very, very soon. But we aren't done yet. There's one other thing, and that is accessibility. Now, classes are very special. There's a lot of features that a class provides, and one of those is the ability to hide code and hide functionality. Like, for example, we could hide the getTerms method so that it cannot be used outside of the class. So that if we tried to use getTerms, then PHP would actually throw an error because it would not be able to find getTerms. Well, that of course doesn't make sense because getTerms is definitely something that we want to be able to call from outside of the class. So we should mark this as a public method. That means that it is accessible whenever we are using the object. And we really want most of these to be public because we want to be able to get a term. We want to be able to search or add or update or delete. But when it comes to getting the data from the file or setting the data to the file, we don't need to access that outside of the class. These are things that our other methods rely upon. So really what we should do is mark these as private because there's really no reason that we should be calling get data or set data from an object like this. I mean, there's no reason. So with those changes, we now have a class that's going to allow us to work with that data. Of course, we've kind of broken all of this. So the first thing we need to do is go to our app.php and we need to require this class. So really we don't need the file functions because those functions are gone. So let's change that to FileDataProvider.class.php. Now we do need to require our glossary term inside of the FileDataProvider because we do use that class. And let's go ahead and delete file functions. But then we also need to go to the other parts of our application and use this new class. So if we go to index.php, not inside of admin, here we are using search terms and we are using get terms. So for the sake of simplicity, we're going to new up the FileDataProvider. We need to pass in the path to that file, which is currently inside of our config. And we will pass that value, which was data file. So we will have that there. And then we can use that data in order to search and get the items. Now, of course, other parts of the application is not going to work. That's going to be fine because we will eventually fix all of that. But let's go to the browser. Let's refresh the page and notice that everything works just fine. And if we comment out this line that gets our terms, we are, of course, going to see that, well, things have gone very wrong there. So we know that our code is working. But this also adds a complication in that every time that we want to work with our data, we have to create this new FileDataProvider object. Wouldn't it be nice if we just had one throughout the entire application so that we could access it through the config? Like this, for example, if we said config and then provider, and then we would use our methods. Well, that is something that we can definitely do, and we will start implementing that in the next lesson.